It is pitiful to see how they crowd those poor wretches, 650 or 700 in a ship, the men standing in the hold tied to stakes, the women between decks, and those that were with child in the great cabin, and in that hot climate occasions an intolerable stench. James Barbette.
The Middle Passage, as the transoceanic shipment of human cargo was called, was a living horror, as James Barbette and others who voyaged on the slave ships recalled.
Being in a confined space, if anybody was ill with an infectious disease, that soon spread. So we have these terrible stories of entire shiploads dying.
Seeing women throwing their babies overboard, let alone themselves, because they knew that where they were going, where they were headed, was something so terrible. Not only were they taken from their homeland, Africa, they were taken from their families, their life source. And who wants to be taken from the life source? No one, no human being wants to be separated from their family.
New World planters paid so much for slaves that a slave trader could lose over half his human cargo and still make a handsome profit. Once in the Americas, many Africans continued to resist. In 1712, black and Indian slaves in New York killed 9 whites before they were overwhelmed.
What would a master do with a slave who burned the barn or committed crimes of various sorts? Well, some masters would try to use force, greater and greater force, to break the resistance of the slave. Others would give up and sell the slaves. Our history is simply filled with how violence had to be applied every step along the way. It is impossible to maintain a system of slavery without violence. The violence of masters and the violence of resisting slaves.
The English trade in slaves became an essential part of the Atlantic commercial system, along routes historians once called the triangular trade.
When the demand for slaves had increased, many of these societies in Africa started going to war solely to obtain slaves. So the turmoil of the slave trade was terrible inside of Africa. For every slave that was brought across the Atlantic, some died in Africa in the wars. So we must consider that the toll on human beings inside Africa and on their political structures was enormous.
One of the great contradictions or paradoxes in American history is how a people who would become the champions of liberty and freedom could practice slavery.